Money can't buy happiness, but it can certainly buy silence. At least, that's what Marcus Wellington believed when he walked into that lawyer's office with a smile wider than his bank account. For 15 years, he thought he had played the perfect game, marrying for love while protecting his wealth with what he believed was an ironclad prenuptial agreement. But sometimes, the most devastating truths come from the most unexpected places. Sometimes, a curious teenager with nothing but time and a laptop can unravel decades of careful planning in a single afternoon. And sometimes, the very document you think is your safety net turns out to be nothing more than expensive paper. This is the story of how one man's arrogance met its match in the form of a 17-year-old girl who refused to accept that her family's destruction was inevitable. It's about the moment when laughter turns to panic, when confidence crumbles into desperation, and when the hunter becomes the hunted. What Marcus didn't know as he signed those divorce papers was that his stepdaughter had already discovered his secret. What he couldn't have imagined was that the very prenup he'd been bragging about for over a decade had never been legally filed. And what he definitely didn't see coming was that this young woman would use his own weapon against him in ways he never thought possible. Get ready for a story of family loyalty, legal loopholes, and the sweet taste of justice served by someone who had every reason to stay quiet, but chose to speak up instead. Marcus Wellington had always been the kind of man who believed his money could solve any problem. At 52, he stood 6 feet tall with silver hair that cost more to maintain than most people made in a month. His suits were custom-tailored, his watch was Swiss, and his confidence was unshakable. Today, as he sat in the mahogany-paneled office of Henderson, Mills and Associates, that confidence was about to be tested in ways he never imagined. The divorce papers lay spread across the polished conference table like a feast of legal jargon. Marcus picked up his gold-plated pen, the same one he'd used to sign million-dollar contracts, and smiled at his soon-to-be ex-wife, Patricia. She sat across from him, her dark skin glowing despite the stress lines that had appeared around her eyes over the past few months. Even in this moment of ending their 15-year marriage, Marcus had to admit she was still beautiful. "Well, Patricia," Marcus said, his voice carrying that particular tone of smugness that had irritated her for years, "I guess this is it." He flourished his signature across the bottom of the document with theatrical flair. "I hope you enjoyed your time in my world, because you're about to find out what the real world looks like." Patricia's lawyer, a sharp-eyed woman named Janet Morrison, placed a protective hand on her client's shoulder. "Mrs. Wellington, you don't have to listen to this." But Marcus wasn't finished. He leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking under his weight, and chuckled. "Oh, but she does. You see, Janet, your client seems to have forgotten about our little prenuptial agreement. The one that clearly states she gets exactly what she brought into this marriage." He paused for effect, which was nothing. The prenup had been Marcus's masterstroke, or so he believed. Drafted by the best lawyers his money could buy, it was designed to protect every penny of his considerable wealth. Real estate holdings worth millions, investment portfolios, business interests, even the art collection he'd inherited from his father. All of it was supposedly safe from Patricia's reach. Patricia closed her eyes briefly, then opened them with a determination that surprised everyone in the room. "I know about the prenup, Marcus. I signed it, remember?" "That's right. You did," Marcus said, his laughter now bordering on cruel. "You signed away any claim to my money, my businesses, my properties. All of it." He gestured around the expensive office. "You get to keep your little teaching salary and that beat-up Honda in the driveway. Oh, and that daughter of yours, of course. I'm sure she'll be thrilled to know you're both about to be homeless." The mention of Keisha, Patricia's 17-year-old daughter from her first marriage, caused Patricia's composure to crack slightly. Keisha had been 8 when Patricia married Marcus, and despite his wealth and initial charm, the teenager had never warmed to her stepfather. She was too smart, too observant, and far too willing to call out his behavior when he thought no one was watching. "Keisha will be fine," Patricia said quietly. "We'll both be fine." Marcus's lawyer, a weaselly man named Robert Chun who charged $1,000 an hour, cleared his throat. "If we could just finalize the property division according to the prenuptial agreement." "By all means," Marcus interrupted, still grinning. "Let's get this over with. I have a golf game at 3. What Marcus didn't know What he couldn't have known was that at that very moment, Keisha Washington was sitting in the public library 3 miles away, staring at a computer screen with growing excitement. She'd been there for hours, ever since skipping her afternoon classes to research something that had been bothering her for weeks. Keisha had always been curious about legal matters. Maybe it came from watching her mother struggle through her first divorce when Keisha was 7, or maybe it was just her natural inclination to question everything. Whatever the reason, when she'd overheard her mother crying on the phone about the prenup a few nights earlier, Keisha had decided to learn everything she could about prenuptial agreements. What she'd discovered had shocked her. At the lawyer's office, Marcus was now reviewing the final terms of the divorce settlement with obvious satisfaction. According to the prenup, Patricia would leave the marriage with only what she'd brought into it: some personal belongings, a small savings account, and her daughter. The house they'd lived in for over a decade would remain Marcus's, as would the vacation home in the Hamptons, the art collection, the expensive cars, and all of his business interests. $14 million. Marcus mused aloud, tapping his pen against the table. That's what my accountant estimates my net worth at these days. And, according to our agreement, you get exactly $0 of it. He looked at Patricia with mock concern. I do hope you've been saving your teacher's salary, dear. You're going to need it. Patricia's hands were clenched in her lap, but her voice remained steady. I've been saving, Marcus. More than you know. What's that supposed to mean? Marcus asked, his smile faltering slightly. Nothing, Patricia replied. Just that I've learned to be more careful about important documents than I used to be. The comment puzzled Marcus, but he dismissed it quickly. Patricia had always been prone to cryptic statements when she was upset. He returned his attention to the papers, scanning through the property division one more time. The beach house, the stock portfolio, the antique car collection, all of it staying with him, just as the prenup specified. You know, Marcus said, unable to resist one more jab. I almost feel bad for you. 15 years of marriage, and you're walking away with less than my monthly wine budget. He chuckled again. But, hey, that's what happens when you don't read the fine print. Janet Morrison had heard enough. Mr. Wellington, if you could please just sign the remaining documents so we can conclude this proceeding. Of course, Marcus said, still smirking. Though I have to say, this has been one of the most entertaining afternoons I've had in months. As Marcus signed his name with flourishes across multiple pages, his phone buzzed with a text message. He glanced at it briefly, something about his business partner wanting to meet later that week, and then returned his attention to the documents. The phone buzzed again, then again. Annoyed, Marcus picked it up to silence it, and saw that he had several missed calls from his financial advisor. Excuse me for just a moment, Marcus said, standing up. Business calls. He stepped out into the hallway and dialed his advisor's number. Tom, what's so urgent that you're blowing up my phone during my divorce proceedings? Marcus, we need to talk. Tom's voice was tight with concern. Something's come up with the Patterson merger. There's a question about some of your documentation, and I need to verify. Tom, whatever it is can wait until tomorrow, Marcus interrupted. I'm in the middle of finalizing my divorce, and, frankly, I'm enjoying watching my ex-wife realize she's about to be poor again. Marcus, this is serious. I need you to bring me all your legal documents related to your marriage. The prenup, property transfers, everything. There might be an issue with, the prenup is fine, Tom. Trust me, I paid enough for it. Marcus was growing impatient. My lawyer assured me it was bulletproof. Just bring the documents, okay? Tomorrow morning, first thing. Marcus hung up, irritated by the interruption, but not particularly worried. Tom was always anxious about something, and the Patterson merger was proceeding smoothly despite his concerns. The prenup was solid. Marcus had made sure of that years ago. Back in the conference room, the final signatures were being completed. Marcus reclaimed his seat and finished signing his name to the last few documents, each signature accompanied by a small, satisfied sound. Well, he said finally, sliding the papers back across the table. I think that concludes our business here. He stood up and straightened his tie. Patricia, it's been educational. I hope you and Keisha find somewhere nice to live. Maybe a little apartment across town. Patricia gathered her purse and looked at Marcus with an expression he couldn't quite read. We'll be fine, Marcus. Better than fine, actually. I'm sure you will, Marcus replied dismissively. People adjust to their circumstances. You'll remember how to be poor again soon enough. As Patricia and her lawyer prepared to leave, Marcus's phone rang again. This time it was his housekeeper, Maria, calling from the estate. Mr. Wellington, Maria's accented voice was worried. Miss Keisha, she is here asking for documents. She says she needs to see papers about the marriage agreement. Marcus felt a small flutter of annoyance. What? Why is she bothering you about that? Where's her mother? Her mother is not here, sir. Miss Keisha, she has been in your office for maybe 1 hour, looking through the filing cabinet. She says her mother gave her permission, but tell her to get out of my office immediately, Marcus snapped. She has no business going through my personal papers. I try to tell her, sir, but she says she is looking for something specific. Something about. The line went quiet for a moment, and Marcus could hear voices in the background. Then, Maria came back on the line, sounding even more concerned. Mr. Wellington, Miss Keisha says to tell you she found what she was looking for. She says the papers are not what you think they are. Marcus felt his first real flutter of concern, though he pushed it down immediately. Maria, just tell her to leave my office, and go wait for her mother. We'll be home soon. But, as Marcus hung up the phone, Patricia was watching him with a small, knowing smile that made him deeply uncomfortable. Problem at home? She asked innocently. Nothing I can't handle, Marcus replied. But, for the first time that afternoon, he wasn't entirely sure that was true. 20 minutes later, as Marcus drove his BMW through the tree-lined streets of his exclusive neighborhood, he tried to shake off the strange feeling that had settled over him since Maria's call. Keisha had always been a nosy kid, too smart for her own good. But what could she possibly find in his files that would matter now? The divorce was finalized, the prenup had served its purpose, and by this time tomorrow, Patricia and her daughter would be packing their things and moving out of his life forever. Marcus pulled into his circular driveway and sat in his car for a moment, looking at the imposing Tudor-style mansion he'd called home for the past 15 years. Worth nearly $3 million, it was his pride and joy, a symbol of everything he'd accomplished. The manicured lawns, the fountain in the center of the driveway, the tall windows that gleamed in the afternoon sun, all of it was his, and his alone. He found Keisha sitting at the kitchen island, a stack of papers spread out in front of her, her laptop open beside them. She looked up when he entered, and Marcus was struck by how much she resembled her mother, with the same dark eyes and determined expression. But, where Patricia's determination had always seemed gentle, Keisha's had an edge to it that had always made Marcus wary. Hello, Marcus, Keisha said calmly. She'd stopped calling him dad, or even stepdad years ago, much to his irritation. Keisha, Marcus set his briefcase down and loosened his tie. I hear you've been going through my private papers. Care to explain why? Research, Keisha replied simply. For a school project on contract law. Marcus laughed, some of his confidence returning. Contract law? Ambitious for a high school student. Find anything interesting? Keisha picked up a document from the stack. Marcus recognized it as a copy of the prenuptial agreement, and studied it thoughtfully. Actually, yes. I found something very interesting. Oh, and what's that? Keisha looked up at him with eyes that seemed far older than 17. I found out that this prenup was never properly filed with the county clerk's office. Marcus felt the blood drain from his face, but he forced himself to laugh. That's ridiculous. Of course it was filed. My lawyers handled everything. Did they? Keisha turned her laptop around so Marcus could see the screen. It showed the county clerk's database, with a search result displaying no records found for the prenuptial agreement between Marcus Wellington and Patricia Washington. According to the state database, there's no record of this prenup ever being officially filed, Keisha continued, her voice steady and matter-of-fact. Which means, legally speaking, it doesn't exist. Marcus stared at the screen, his mind racing. This had to be a mistake. His lawyers had assured him that everything was properly filed and legally binding. He'd paid them tens of thousands of dollars to make sure every I was dotted and every T was crossed. You're wrong, Marcus said, though his voice lacked its usual conviction. The prenup is valid. I have copies, signatures, witnesses. Signatures and witnesses don't matter if the document was never filed with the appropriate authorities, Keisha replied. I spent the morning at the library researching prenuptial law. In this state, prenups have to be filed within 30 days of the marriage to be legally binding. Yours never was. Marcus sank into a chair across from Keisha, his legs suddenly feeling weak. If what she was saying was true, if the prenup really hadn't been filed properly, then Patricia had just divorced him without any legal protection for his assets. She would be entitled to half of everything he owned. This is impossible, Marcus muttered, more to himself than to Keisha. My lawyers would never have made such a basic mistake. Maybe they did, maybe they didn't, Keisha said, gathering up the papers. But the fact remains that there's no legal record of this prenup anywhere in the system. I checked 3 different databases. Marcus looked at the teenager sitting across from him. The same girl he'd tolerated for 15 years, the same girl he'd always considered a nuisance, and realized that she had just potentially destroyed everything he thought he'd protected. What do you want? Marcus asked quietly. Keisha stood up and closed her laptop. Nothing from you, Marcus. I just thought you should know that my mom isn't as helpless as you seem to think she is. Patricia walked through the front door with the quiet confidence of someone who had just won a battle she'd been preparing for longer than anyone realized. Marcus watched her from the kitchen doorway, studying her face for any sign of the broken woman he'd expected to see after their divorce proceedings. Instead, he saw something that unsettled him deeply: calm determination. We need to talk, Patricia said, setting her purse down on the entry table. She was still wearing the navy blue suit she'd worn to the lawyer's office, but she'd taken off the jacket, and her shoulders seemed less tense than they'd been in months. About what? Marcus asked, though his voice had lost the arrogant edge it had carried just hours earlier. About our daughter's remarkable research skills, Patricia replied. She told me you two had an interesting conversation. Marcus felt his stomach clench. Patricia, whatever Keisha thinks she found, it doesn't change anything. The divorce is final. The property division is settled. Is it? Patricia walked past him into the living room, a space she'd helped design but had never been allowed to truly call her own. She ran her fingers along the back of the Italian leather sofa that cost more than most people's cars. Tell me, Marcus, when was the last time you actually looked at the filing receipts for our prenup? I don't need to look at filing receipts, Marcus said, following her. My lawyers handled everything. Robert Chun assured me. Robert Chun, Patricia interrupted, was a second-year associate 15 years ago when we got married. Did you know that? He was working under Gerald Hoffman, who died of a heart attack 6 months after our wedding. The same Gerald Hoffman who was supposed to file our prenuptial agreement. Marcus stared at her, pieces of a puzzle he didn't want to solve beginning to fall into place. What are you saying? I'm saying that when Gerald died, a lot of his cases fell through the cracks, including ours. Patricia moved to the mantelpiece, where photos of their wedding day still stood. She picked up one of the pictures, Marcus in his expensive tuxedo, Patricia radiant in white silk, and studied it thoughtfully. I hired a private investigator 6 months ago, Marcus. Did you know that? A private investigator? Marcus's voice cracked slightly. For what? To find out exactly what happened to our prenup. Patricia set the photo back down, but turned it to face the wall. His name is David Torres. Former police detective, very thorough, very discreet. Would you like to know what he found? Marcus sank onto the sofa, his legs finally giving out completely. Patricia, whatever you think you've discovered. Gerald Hoffman never filed our prenuptial agreement with the county clerk. Patricia continued, her voice gaining strength. He died before he could complete the process. Robert Chun, young and overwhelmed with all of Gerald's unfinished cases, simply assumed it had been done. He never followed up, never verified, never checked. That's impossible, Marcus whispered, but even as he said it, he knew it wasn't. The phone calls from his financial advisor, the urgent requests for documentation, it was all starting to make sense. David has copies of all of Gerald's final files, Patricia said, including the handwritten note on our case file that says, file with county clerk, priority. That note was dated 3 days before Gerald's heart attack. 3 days before he could actually do it. Marcus's mind raced back to the months following their wedding. He remembered Robert Chin calling to say that all the paperwork was in order, but had he ever specifically confirmed that the prenup was filed? Had Marcus ever asked for proof? Or had he simply assumed that paying expensive lawyers guaranteed expensive results? Even if that's true, Marcus said, grasping for any argument, it's been 15 years. There must be some kind of statute of limitations. There isn't, Patricia replied. Not for this. An unfiled prenuptial agreement is simply invalid, regardless of when it's discovered. David checked that very thoroughly. Marcus stood up abruptly and began pacing. This is ridiculous. I won't stand for it. I'll fight this in court. I'll hire the best lawyers in the state. With what money? Patricia asked quietly. What do you mean, with what money? I have millions. No, Marcus. We have millions. Or rather, we had millions, and now I have half of them. Patricia opened her purse and pulled out a thick manila envelope. Janet Morrison filed the corrected property division papers this afternoon. Based on the invalid prenup and 15 years of marriage, I'm entitled to exactly 50% of all marital assets. Marcus felt the room spinning around him. You can't do this. The divorce is already final. The papers are signed. The papers were signed based on fraudulent information, Patricia corrected. When one party enters into a divorce proceeding believing a prenuptial agreement is valid, and that agreement turns out to be legally worthless, the entire property division can be challenged and overturned. Janet Morrison knew about this? Marcus asked, the reality of Patricia's strategy beginning to dawn on him. Janet has known for weeks. Patricia confirmed. We've been preparing for this moment very carefully. Every asset, every investment, every piece of property has been cataloged and valued. Marcus grabbed his phone and speed-dialed Robert Chin's number. The phone rang 4 times before going to voicemail. He tried again, with the same result. Robert's probably busy, Patricia observed. I imagine he's having a very difficult afternoon. When lawyers make mistakes this significant, they tend to panic. Marcus's phone rang, startling him. The caller ID showed his financial advisor's number. Tom, Marcus answered quickly. Thank God you called. Something's gone wrong with. Marcus, where the hell have you been? Tom's voice was strained. I've been trying to reach you for hours. We have a serious problem. The prenup, Marcus said heavily. I know. You know? How long have you known that it was never filed? I just found out today, Marcus replied, shooting a glance at Patricia, who was listening to his conversation with obvious interest. Well, it gets worse, Tom continued. The Patterson merger is off. When their lawyers discovered that your prenup wasn't valid, they got nervous about your financial stability. They're worried about how much of your assets you might lose in the divorce, and they don't want to be involved in a deal where the numbers could change dramatically. Marcus felt his knees give out again, and he slumped back onto the sofa. The Patterson merger wasn't just a business deal. It was a $50 million acquisition that would have doubled his company's value. How did they find out about the prenup? Marcus asked weakly. I had to tell them, Tom replied. When you asked me to verify your documentation for their due diligence process, I discovered the problem. The prenup wasn't in our legal files because it was never properly executed. I had to inform them before they committed to the merger. Marcus hung up the phone and stared at Patricia, who was now sitting calmly in the armchair across from him. The Patterson merger, she said. $50 million, wasn't it? I remember you talking about it. How could you have known that would be affected by this? Marcus asked. I didn't, Patricia admitted. But I did know that a man like you would have based a lot of business decisions on the assumption that your personal assets were protected. When that protection turns out to be an illusion, well, she shrugged. Business partners tend to get nervous. Marcus's phone rang again. This time it was the number for Henderson, Mills and Associates, Robert Chin's firm. Mr. Wellington, an unfamiliar voice said when Marcus answered. This is senior partner William Henderson. We need to schedule an emergency meeting to discuss your situation. What situation? Marcus asked, though he already knew the answer. The malpractice claim that will undoubtedly be filed against our firm regarding your prenuptial agreement. Henderson replied bluntly. Robert Chin has admitted that the document was never properly filed, and we need to discuss how we're going to handle this matter. Handle what matter? Mr. Wellington, you paid our firm to create and file a legally binding prenuptial agreement. We failed to do so, which has now cost you millions of dollars in what you thought was protected assets. This is a textbook case of legal malpractice. Marcus ended the call and looked at Patricia with new understanding. You planned all of this. I planned to protect myself and my daughter, Patricia replied. Everything else was just a fortunate consequence of your lawyer's incompetence. When did you find out about the prenup? 6 months ago, like I said. But I suspected something was wrong long before that. Patricia stood up and walked to the window that overlooked their expansive backyard. Do you remember last year when you were bragging to Richard Pemberton at his anniversary party about how your prenup was ironclad? You were drunk, and you kept talking about how Patricia would never get a dime of your money if we divorced. Marcus remembered the party, remembered the conversation with his neighbor, but he couldn't see where Patricia was going with this. Richard's wife is a paralegal, Patricia continued. She's worked in family law for 20 years. After listening to you brag for an hour about your bulletproof prenup, she mentioned to me that most prenups aren't worth the paper they're printed on if they're not filed properly. So you decided to investigate, Marcus said flatly. I decided to be careful. You've been talking about divorce for months, Marcus. You thought I didn't notice, but I heard you on the phone with your lawyer discussing whether you could find grounds to leave me. I knew it was only a matter of time. Marcus thought back to those phone calls, the conversations he'd thought were private. He'd been planning his exit strategy for over a year, confident that his prenup would allow him to end the marriage without losing anything significant. So you hired the private investigator, Marcus continued. I hired David Torres, yes. It took him 3 weeks to track down what had happened to our prenup. When he found Gerald Hoffman's unfinished file, I knew I had options. And Keisha? How long has she known? I told her last week, Patricia said. I wanted to prepare her for what was coming. I also wanted her to understand how important it is to pay attention to details, especially when it comes to legal matters. She's 17 years old, Marcus protested. She shouldn't be involved in this. She's 17 years old and smarter than most adults I know, Patricia countered. Including, apparently, your expensive lawyers. Marcus's phone rang again, but this time he didn't answer. He was beginning to understand that every call would bring more bad news, more complications, more evidence of how thoroughly his world was unraveling. What happens now? He asked quietly. Now the lawyers sort everything out, Patricia replied. Janet estimates it will take about 6 weeks to complete the revised property division. During that time, all of our assets will be frozen to prevent either of us from hiding or transferring anything. Frozen? Marcus looked up sharply. What do you mean, frozen? I mean you can't sell the beach house, you can't liquidate investments, you can't transfer money to offshore accounts or give expensive gifts to friends. Patricia's tone was matter of fact, but Marcus could hear the steel underneath. Everything stays exactly where it is until the courts decide how to split it fairly. And if I refuse to cooperate, then you'll be held in contempt of court, and the judge will probably award me an even larger percentage of the assets. Patricia picked up her purse. Marcus, I've been planning this for 6 months. I've considered every angle, every possible response you might have. The best thing you can do now is cooperate and accept that this marriage is ending very differently than you expected. As Patricia walked toward the door, Marcus called after her. Where are you going? To pick up Keisha from school, Patricia replied. Then, we're going to look at apartments. Apartments? You don't need to move out immediately. The house is half mine now, Patricia interrupted. But Keisha and I have decided we'd prefer to start fresh somewhere else. Somewhere without quite so many bad memories. After Patricia left, Marcus sat alone in his living room, surrounded by the expensive furniture and art that had once represented his success. Now they felt like museum pieces in someone else's collection. His phone buzzed with a text message from Robert Chen. We need to talk. Emergency meeting tomorrow at 8 a.m. Another text came from his business partner. Heard about the merger falling through. What's going on? The next morning arrived gray and cold, matching Marcus's mood as he sat in the conference room at Henderson, Mills and Associates. The same room where he'd signed his divorce papers just 24 hours earlier now felt like a courtroom where he was on trial. William Henderson, the senior partner, sat across from him with a stack of documents that seemed to grow thicker by the hour. The situation is worse than we initially thought, Henderson said, his usually polished demeanor showing signs of strain. Our malpractice insurance carrier is already asking questions, and Patricia's attorney has indicated they're prepared to file suit not just for the invalid prenup, but for intentional misrepresentation. Intentional misrepresentation? Marcus leaned forward. I didn't intentionally misrepresent anything. I trusted you people to do your jobs. That's the problem, Robert Chin interjected from his seat at the far end of the table. He looked like he hadn't slept in days. I assured you multiple times over the years that the prenup was valid and enforceable. Every time you asked about it, every time you referenced it in other legal documents, I confirmed its validity without actually checking the filing status. Henderson shot Chun a withering look before continuing. Mr. Wellington, we need to discuss your options. The first is to settle with Patricia quickly and quietly, accepting the 50-50 division and moving on. Absolutely not, Marcus said immediately. I worked for 15 years to build that wealth. I'm not handing half of it over because of your firm's incompetence. The second option, Henderson continued, is to fight it in court. However, I must warn you that given the circumstances, you're unlikely to win, and the legal fees could easily reach into the hundreds of thousands. Fight it, Marcus said without hesitation. I want the best litigation team you have. I want every possible angle explored. Marcus, Chin said quietly, there's something else you need to know. Patricia's investigator didn't just discover the unfiled prenup. He's been very thorough in his research. What do you mean? Henderson opened one of the folders and pulled out a thick report. Apparently, this David Torres has documented several other instances where your legal and financial affairs may not be as secure as you believed. Marcus felt his stomach drop. What kind of instances? The beach house in the Hamptons, Henderson began, reading from the report. You purchased it in 2019 using funds from your business account. However, since you and Patricia were married at the time, and since she wasn't explicitly excluded from ownership by a valid prenup, she may have a claim to that property as well. That's ridiculous. I bought that house with my business income. Income earned during a marriage is generally considered marital property, Chin explained. The prenup was supposed to protect your business assets, but since it's invalid. The art collection, Henderson continued. Value estimated at $1.2 million. Purchased entirely during your marriage with marital funds. The classic car collection, Chin added. For $100,000, also acquired during the marriage. Even your business, Henderson said, closing the folder, Wellington Consulting Group. According to this report, you used marital funds to expand the business in 2018. Patricia may be entitled to a percentage of the company itself. Marcus stared at the lawyers in disbelief. She can't take my business. That's how I make my living. She can't take the whole business, Henderson clarified. But if marital funds were used for business purposes, she may be entitled to a percentage of its value. How much are we talking about? Henderson consulted another document. Your business was valued at $8 million for the Patterson merger. If Patricia can prove that marital funds contributed to its growth, she could be entitled to up to $4 million of its value. Chin finished. Marcus stood up abruptly and walked to the window. This is insane. 24 hours ago, I was a wealthy man getting divorced from a teacher. Now you're telling me she could end up owning half my business. We're telling you what Patricia's lawyers are likely to argue, Henderson said. Whether they can prove it in court is another matter entirely. Speaking of Patricia's lawyers, Chun said hesitantly, there's one more thing. Marcus turned around slowly. What now? Janet Morrison isn't just representing Patricia in the divorce. She's also prepared to file a separate lawsuit against our firm for legal malpractice. The damages she's seeking are substantial. How substantial? $15 million, Henderson said quietly. She's arguing that our failure to properly file the prenup has cost you that amount in assets you'll now lose to Patricia. Marcus laughed, but there was no humor in it. So you're telling me that I'm going to lose millions to my ex-wife because of your mistake, and then you're going to get sued for millions more because of the same mistake? That's essentially correct, Henderson admitted. And what happens to me in all of this? You'll be caught in the middle of two very expensive lawsuits, Chin replied. Unless you settle both matters quickly. Marcus returned to his chair and buried his face in his hands. How did this happen? How did everything go wrong so fast? Sometimes these things cascade, Henderson said diplomatically. One problem reveals another, which reveals another. This isn't a cascade, Marcus said, looking up. This is Patricia. She orchestrated all of this. The lawyers exchanged glances. Mr. Wellington, Henderson said carefully. What makes you think Patricia orchestrated anything? The prenup filing error was our mistake, not hers. She hired a private investigator 6 months ago. She knew about the prenup problem for months and said nothing. She let me proceed with the divorce thinking I was protected. Then, she ambushed me. That's not illegal, Chen pointed out. In fact, it's smart strategy. It's manipulation, Marcus insisted. She knew the truth and deliberately concealed it to gain an advantage. That may be morally questionable, Henderson said, but it's not legally actionable. Patricia had no obligation to inform you that your own lawyers had made a filing error. Marcus's phone buzzed with a text message from his business partner, David Kim. We need to meet. The Wellington Group situation is affecting other deals. I have to go, Marcus said, gathering his things. I want you to prepare for a fight. I don't care what it costs. Marcus, Chun said as Marcus reached the door. You should consider the possibility that fighting this could cost you more than just settling. Let me worry about that, Marcus replied. An hour later, Marcus sat across from David Kim in the conference room at Wellington Consulting Group. David was a thin, nervous man who handled the financial side of their business, while Marcus managed client relationships. They'd been partners for 8 years, and the company had been extremely successful until yesterday. The Patterson merger was our biggest deal ever, David said, spreading financial projections across the table. Without it, our growth projections are completely off. The other partners are starting to ask questions. Wellington Consulting Group had 6 partners, but Marcus owned 60% of the company. The other partners had smaller stakes, and were generally content to let Marcus run things as long as the profits kept flowing. What kind of questions? Marcus asked. Questions about whether your personal legal problems are going to affect the business. Questions about whether we should be looking for new leadership. Questions about whether they should consider selling their stakes before the company value drops further. Marcus felt a new wave of panic. The company value isn't going to drop. This is a temporary setback. Is it? David pulled out another document. I've been doing some research since yesterday. If Patricia gets half of your 60% stake in the company, she becomes a 30% owner. That makes her the second largest shareholder. She can't just become a partner, Marcus protested. She knows nothing about consulting. She doesn't have to be an active partner, David explained. But, as a 30% owner, she'd have voting rights on major decisions. She could block deals, change business direction, even demand a seat on the board of directors. That's ridiculous. I built this company. You built it with marital funds, Marcus. At least partially. I remember you putting in $1 million capital injection in 2018 when we expanded to the West Coast. Where did that money come from? Marcus closed his eyes. Joint accounts. But I earned that money. During your marriage. Which means it was marital property. Which means Patricia may have a claim to any business growth that resulted from it. You're supposed to be my business partner, David. You're supposed to be on my side. I am on your side, David replied. That's why I'm trying to help you understand how serious this situation is. The other partners are scared, Marcus. They're worried that their investments are going to get tied up in your divorce proceedings. Their investments are safe. The divorce doesn't affect their ownership stakes, doesn't it? If Patricia becomes a 30% owner and decides she wants to liquidate her stake, we'd have to buy her out. Where would we get that kind of money? Marcus hadn't considered that possibility. If Patricia owned part of his business and decided to force a sale of her portion, the company might not have enough cash to buy her out. They'd have to take on debt or sell assets, either of which could destabilize the entire organization. She wouldn't do that, Marcus said. But even as he spoke, he realized he had no idea what Patricia might or might not do. 24 hours ago, he'd thought he knew her completely. Marcus, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. What? Are there any other legal landmines we should know about? Any other documents that might not be properly filed? Any other situations where your personal affairs could affect the business? Marcus thought about all the legal documents he'd signed over the years, all the times he'd trusted lawyers to handle the details while he focused on making money. I don't know, he admitted. You don't know? David's voice rose. Marcus, we have 60 employees depending on this company. We have clients who trust us with millions of dollars in projects. We have contracts and obligations and responsibilities. I need to know if there are other problems coming. I said I don't know. Marcus snapped. Until yesterday, I thought my prenup was valid. Now I'm finding out my lawyers made a mistake that could cost me half my wealth. How am I supposed to know what other mistakes they might have made? David was quiet for a moment. Then, he pulled out his phone and made a call. Janet, it's David Kim. I need to schedule a meeting with you as soon as possible. We need to discuss the Wellington Group situation. Yes, I understand you're busy with the divorce proceedings. This is related to the divorce. I need to know how Patricia's potential ownership of the company might affect our business operations. Marcus stared at his business partner in shock. You're calling Patricia's lawyer? David ended the call and looked at Marcus with an expression of resignation. I'm calling everyone's lawyer, Marcus. The company needs legal protection, and, right now, I'm not sure you're in a position to provide it. You're betraying me. After everything I've done for you, for this company. I'm trying to save the company, David interrupted. If your personal legal problems destroy Wellington Group, then all of us lose everything. The employees, the partners, the clients. Everyone gets hurt because you trusted the wrong lawyers. Marcus stood up and walked to the window overlooking the city skyline. Wellington Consulting Group occupied the entire 40th floor of a prestigious downtown building, with panoramic views and expensive furnishings that reflected the company's success. He'd worked 12-hour days for 8 years to build this business, and now it was all at risk because of a filing error made 15 years ago. What do you want me to do? Marcus asked quietly. I want you to settle with Patricia quickly and quietly, David replied. Give her half of your personal assets and protect the business. If you fight this in court, it's going to drag on for months or years, and the uncertainty will destroy our client relationships. And if Patricia ends up owning part of the company, then we'll deal with that when it happens. But fighting her in court guarantees that she'll be motivated to take as much as possible. Settling amicably might convince her to be reasonable about the business assets. Marcus's phone rang. It was Tom, his financial advisor, calling for the 3rd time since yesterday. Tom, what now? Marcus answered wearily. Marcus, we need to meet immediately. There's been another development. What kind of development? The IRS is asking questions about some of your tax filings from the past few years. Specifically, they want to know about business deductions you claimed for the beach house and the art collection. Marcus felt the world spinning around him again. What kind of questions? If you claimed business deductions for personal assets, and those assets were actually purchased with marital funds, then the deductions might be invalid, which could mean penalties, interest, and back taxes. How much are we talking about? Potentially several $100,000. Maybe more. Marcus ended the call and looked at David, who had overheard enough of the conversation to understand the implications. The IRS? David asked. Apparently, my legal problems are creating tax problems too. Marcus, you need to settle this with Patricia before it gets any worse. Every day you wait, another problem surfaces. She planned this, Marcus said, more to himself than to David. Somehow, she planned all of this. Maybe she did, maybe she didn't. But the problems are real, regardless of who uncovered them. Your lawyers made mistakes, you made mistakes, and now you have to deal with the consequences. Marcus walked back to the conference table and slumped into the conference room at Janet Morrison's law office was smaller than the one at Marcus's attorney's firm, but it felt more powerful somehow. Patricia sat across from Marcus with the same calm composure she'd shown throughout their marriage, but now that composure was revealed as strategic patience rather than passive acceptance. Beside her, Janet Morrison reviewed documents with the focused intensity of someone holding all the winning cards. Marcus had brought Robert Chun and a new attorney, Margaret Walsh, who specialized in high-stakes divorce litigation. Margaret was expensive, aggressive, and supposedly the best in the city. But, as she shuffled through her own stack of papers, Marcus could see the concern in her eyes. Even the best lawyers had limits when the facts were overwhelmingly against their clients. Let's begin with a simple question, Janet said, looking directly at Marcus. Are you prepared to accept the reality that your prenuptial agreement is invalid? We're prepared to discuss all options, Margaret replied carefully. That's not what I asked, Janet continued. Mr. Wellington, do you accept that your prenup was never properly filed and, therefore, has no legal standing? Marcus met Patricia's gaze across the table. Her dark eyes were steady, revealing nothing of what she was thinking. "I accept that there appears to be a filing problem," he said finally. "Good," Janet replied, making a note. "Then, we can proceed with negotiations based on the legal reality that all assets acquired during your 15-year marriage are subject to equitable distribution." Margaret leaned forward. "My client is willing to consider a reasonable settlement, but we need to discuss the specific assets in question and their actual marital status." Janet opened a thick folder and began pulling out documents. "Let's start with the obvious items. The primary residence, $3.2 million, purchased 2 years after the marriage using joint funds. Clearly marital property." "Agreed," Margaret said reluctantly. "The Hampton Beach house, $1.8 million, purchased in 2019 with funds from Mr. Wellington's business account. However, since Mr. Wellington's business grew during the marriage using marital resources, this property is also subject to division." "We dispute that characterization," Margaret began, but Janet cut her off. "The business records are quite clear," Janet said, sliding a financial analysis across the table. "Wellington Consulting Group received a capital injection of $1 million in 2018. That money came from joint marital accounts. The business used that money to expand to the West Coast, which directly led to the contracts that funded the beach house purchase." Marcus studied the financial analysis and realized with growing dread that Patricia's team had documented every transaction, every business decision, every movement of money that could possibly be traced back to marital assets. "The art collection," Janet continued, $1.2 million, acquired entirely during the marriage. "The classic car collection, $400,000, also acquired during marriage. Mr. Wellington's investment portfolio, currently valued at approximately $6 million, funded through business income earned during the marriage." "What about assets he brought into the marriage?" Margaret asked. Janet consulted another document. "Mr. Wellington's net worth at the time of marriage was approximately $800,000, consisting primarily of his share in Wellington Consulting Group, which was then valued at about $500,000, and personal assets worth approximately $300,000. So everything else was acquired during the marriage," Patricia said quietly. It was the first time she'd spoken since the meeting began. "Everything else," Janet confirmed, "which brings the total marital estate to approximately $14.6 million. Under equitable distribution, Mrs. Wellington is entitled to 50%, or $7.3 million. The number hung in the air like a physical presence. Marcus felt his chest tighten as he did the mental math. $7.3 million. More than half his liquid net worth. "That's assuming we agree to settle," Margaret said. "My client still has the option to fight these claims in court." "He certainly does," Janet agreed pleasantly. "However, I should mention that if we proceed to litigation, we'll be seeking additional damages for the emotional distress caused by Mr. Wellington's fraudulent misrepresentation of the prenup's validity." "Fraudulent misrepresentation?" Marcus spoke for the first time in several minutes. "I didn't know the prenup wasn't filed. How could I have fraudulently misrepresented something I didn't know?" "Mr. Wellington," Janet replied, "you've referenced that prenup dozens of times over the past 15 years. You've used it to justify financial decisions, you've mentioned it in business planning, you've even bragged about it to friends and neighbors. Did you ever once verify that it was actually legally valid?" "I trusted my lawyers to handle that. But you never asked for confirmation. Never requested filing receipts. Never did any due diligence on the most important legal document in your marriage." Janet leaned forward. "That's not just negligence, Mr. Wellington. That's willful ignorance. And when willful ignorance is used to control another person's financial future, it becomes something much worse." Marcus looked at Patricia, searching her face for some sign of the woman he'd married. "Patricia, this is ridiculous. You know I never intentionally deceived you about the prenup." Patricia was quiet for a long moment before responding. "Marcus, for 15 years you told me that if we ever divorced, I would get nothing. You said it when we argued about money. You said it when I wanted to go back to school for my master's degree. You said it when I suggested we should put my name on the beach house deed. I was protecting my assets. You were controlling me," Patricia corrected. "Every time I wanted to make a decision that might affect our finances, you reminded me that I had no legal claim to any of it. You used that prenup like a weapon. That's not how I intended it. Maybe not, Patricia said. But that's how you used it. And now we know it was never real to begin with. Janet pulled out another folder. There's also the matter of the tax issues. Marcus's stomach dropped. What about the tax issues? Our accountant has reviewed Mr. Wellington's tax returns for the past 7 years. He claimed business deductions for several personal assets, including the beach house and portions of the art collection. Those deductions totaled approximately $600,000 over 7 years. Those were legitimate business deductions, Robertson interjected. The beach house was used for client entertainment. Twice, Janet interrupted. According to credit card records and calendar entries, Mr. Wellington used the beach house for business purposes exactly twice in 5 years. The rest of the time, it was personal use. The art collection was in his office. Chun continued weakly. Some pieces were in his office, Janet agreed. Others were in his home, his beach house, and storage. Yet he deducted the full value as business expenses. Margaret made notes as Janet continued. If the IRS determines that these deductions were improper, Mr. Wellington could face penalties and interest in addition to the back taxes owed. Our estimate is approximately $200,000 in additional taxes, plus penalties and interest that could bring the total to nearly $400,000. This is extortion, Marcus said angrily. You're threatening to report me to the IRS unless I settle? We're not threatening anything, Janet replied calmly. The IRS has already begun their own investigation based on information that came to light during our asset review. We're simply informing you that your tax problems are separate from your divorce problems, though they're both consequences of the same pattern of poor legal and financial management. Marcus turned to Patricia again. How long have you been planning this? Planning what, Marcus? Planning to protect myself and my daughter when you decided to divorce me? I've been planning that since the day I married you. You hired a private investigator. You researched my business dealings. You coordinated with accountants and tax attorneys. I did my homework, Patricia said simply. Something you apparently never bothered to do. Let's focus on solutions, Margaret interrupted. What are you looking for in a settlement? Janet consulted her notes. $7.3 million, representing 50% of the marital estate. However, we're willing to accept a structured settlement that takes into account Mr. Wellington's business interests and liquidity concerns. What kind of structure? Mrs. Wellington will accept the primary residence plus $2.5 million in cash. Mr. Wellington can keep the beach house and his cars, but Mrs. Wellington gets 50% ownership of Wellington Consulting Group, which represents the remaining value. Absolutely not, Marcus said immediately. I will not give up control of my company. You're not giving up control, Janet clarified. You're giving up 50% ownership. Mrs. Wellington would be a silent partner with no operational involvement, but with voting rights on major decisions and profit-sharing rights. That's unacceptable. The business is how I make my living. The business was built with marital assets, Patricia said. I helped build it too, Marcus. Maybe not in the office, but I supported you for 15 years while you grew that company. I hosted client dinners, I attended business functions, I managed the household so you could work 60-hour weeks. You were compensated for that. You lived in a mansion, you had unlimited spending money. I had an allowance, Patricia corrected. You gave me an allowance like I was a child. And you reminded me constantly that none of it was really mine. Marcus looked around the room, studying the faces of the lawyers who were negotiating his future. What if I refuse to settle? What if I take this to court and fight every claim? Janet exchanged a glance with Margaret before responding. That's your right, Mr. Wellington. However, I should point out that fighting this case could easily cost you $500,000 in legal fees. Add in the time value of your frozen assets, the ongoing business disruption, and the potential for additional claims if more problems surface during discovery. What additional claims? Margaret asked sharply. Well, Janet said, consulting another folder. Our investigation is still ongoing. Mr. Torres, the private investigator, has found some interesting discrepancies in Mr. Wellington's business expense reports. And there are questions about certain consultant payments that may have been personal rather than business-related. Marcus felt the walls closing in around him. Every document he'd ever signed, every business decision he'd ever made, Every financial transaction from the past 15 years was apparently being dissected by Patricia's team. How much time do I have to decide? Marcus asked. We need an answer by Friday, Janet replied. That gives you 4 days to consider the offer. And if I don't accept? Then we file for full litigation and seek the maximum possible damages under state law, Janet said matter-of-factly, including punitive damages for fraud, emotional distress, and any other claims that emerged during discovery. After the meeting, Marcus sat in his car in the parking lot, trying to process what had just happened. Margaret Walsh sat in the passenger seat, reviewing her notes with obvious concern. What do you think? Marcus asked. I think they have you completely cornered, Margaret replied bluntly. Every claim they're making has documentation to support it. Every number they've cited appears to be accurate. And every threat they've made is legally viable. So I should settle? I think you should consider whether you want to walk away with $7 million or risk losing everything in court. Marcus started the car and pulled out of the parking lot, driving aimlessly through the city while his mind raced through options that all seemed to lead to the same conclusion. Patricia had outplayed him completely. His phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. It was David Kim from the office. Marcus, we need to talk. 2 more partners want to sell their stakes. They're worried about the company's future. How many does that make? 4 of the 6 partners want out. If they sell, you could lose your majority control even without the Patricia situation. Marcus pulled over and parked on a side street. So let me understand this. Patricia wants half my business, my own partners want to abandon ship, the IRS wants to audit my taxes, and my lawyers want to sue me for malpractice. Is that about right? That's about right, David agreed. Marcus, you need to settle with Patricia, and you need to do it quickly. Every day this drags on. The business loses value, and your partners get more nervous. What would you do in my situation? I'd take the settlement, keep what I could, and try to rebuild from there. You're 52 years old, Marcus. You have time to recover financially. But if you lose everything fighting Patricia, you might not have anything left to recover from. That evening, Marcus sat alone in his study, surrounded by financial documents and legal briefs. The house felt enormous and empty, filled with expensive things that might soon belong to someone else. He thought about Patricia, probably sitting in a modest apartment somewhere, planning her next move with the same careful precision she'd used to destroy his sense of security. And he thought about Keisha, the 17-year-old girl whose 6 months later, Marcus Wellington stood in the lobby of a mid-range apartment building, holding a bouquet of flowers and feeling more nervous than he had since his first job interview 30 years ago. The building was nice enough, but it was a far cry from the luxury he'd grown accustomed to. Patricia and Keisha had chosen it carefully, close to good schools, in a safe neighborhood, but modest enough to send a message that they weren't interested in flaunting their newfound wealth. The settlement had been finalized 8 weeks after that pivotal meeting at Janet Morrison's office. Patricia had ultimately accepted a modified version of her original proposal. She kept the family home, received $3 million in cash, and became a 40% owner of Wellington Consulting Group. Marcus retained majority control of his business, but barely, and Patricia's ownership stake meant she had significant voting rights on major decisions. The IRS investigation had cost Marcus an additional $200,000 in back taxes and penalties, exactly as Janet had predicted. His business partners had stabilized once the divorce was settled, but 2 of them had still sold their stakes to outside investors, changing the company dynamic in ways Marcus was still adjusting to. Today was Keisha's 18th birthday, and Marcus had asked Patricia if he could take them both to dinner. It was the first time he'd seen either of them since the settlement signing, and he wasn't sure what to expect. Patricia answered the door wearing jeans and a simple sweater, but she looked more relaxed than Marcus had seen her in years. The stress lines around her eyes had faded, and there was a confidence in her posture that hadn't been there during their marriage. Marcus, she said, neither warm nor hostile. Come in. The apartment was smaller than any place they'd lived together, but it was decorated with care and obvious thought. Books filled built-in shelves, plants thrived by the windows, and the art on the walls was original and meaningful rather than expensive and impressive. It felt like a home in a way their mansion never had. Mom, Marcus is here, Keisha called from another room. A moment later, she appeared in the living room, taller than Marcus remembered, and carrying herself with the assurance of someone who had discovered her own power. "Hello, Marcus," Keisha said, shaking his hand formally. "Thank you for the invitation." "Happy birthday," Marcus replied, handing her the flowers. 18. That's a big milestone. It is, Keisha agreed. I'm legally an adult now. I can vote. I can sign contracts. I can make my own legal decisions. Marcus heard the subtle emphasis on legal decisions and understood that Keisha was reminding him, politely but pointedly, of the role she'd played in changing all their lives. "Have you decided on college yet?" Marcus asked as they walked to his car. He'd offered to drive them to dinner, partly as a gesture of good faith, and partly because he wasn't ready to give up all the small courtesies of their former relationship. "Georgetown University," Keisha replied. "I'm going to study law and business administration." "Law?" Marcus tried to keep his voice neutral. "Family law specifically, with a focus on financial litigation." Keisha met his eyes in the rearview mirror. There seemed to be a lot of people who need help dealing with complicated legal situations. The restaurant Marcus had chosen was elegant, but not ostentatious. He'd learned to read Patricia's preferences more carefully over the past few months. As they were seated at a quiet corner table, he studied the two women who had so thoroughly upended his understanding of himself and his world. "How's the new school?" Marcus asked Keisha as they looked over their menus. "Very good. The law program there is excellent, and they have internships with some of the best family law firms in the country." Keisha smiled slightly. "Ms. Morrison offered to write me a recommendation letter." "Janet Morrison?" "Patricia's lawyer." "My lawyer too." "Now," Keisha corrected. "She's been mentoring me since the settlement. She says I have real potential as a legal researcher." Marcus ordered wine for himself and Patricia, sparkling cider for Keisha, and tried to process the strange turn his life had taken. 6 months ago, he'd been confidently in control of his world. Now he was having dinner with his ex-wife and stepdaughter while the teenager who destroyed his sense of security told him about her plans to become the kind of lawyer who would tear apart men like him. "How's the business?" Patricia asked as their appetizers arrived. "Rebuilding," Marcus admitted. "Losing the Patterson merger hurt, but we've picked up some new clients. The company's stable." "And your new partners? How are you getting along with them?" Marcus paused with his fork halfway to his mouth. "How do you know about my new partners?" "I'm a 40% owner of the company, Marcus. I get monthly financial reports and updates on all major business decisions." Patricia's tone was matter-of-fact, but there was steel underneath it. "Did you think I was going to be a silent partner in name only?" "I hadn't really thought about it," Marcus admitted. "You should probably start thinking about it," Keisha interjected. "Mom's been taking business classes online. She's very interested in understanding how companies operate." Marcus looked at Patricia with new concern. "Business classes?" "MBA program," Patricia confirmed. "Online through Northwestern. I should have my degree by the time Keisha graduates from college." "You're getting an MBA?" "I'm 50 years old, Marcus, not dead. I have 40% ownership in a successful consulting company, plus enough capital to explore other investment opportunities. Did you think I was just going to sit back and collect dividend checks?" Marcus was quiet for a moment as he absorbed this information. In all the months of legal negotiations and settlement discussions, it had never occurred to him that Patricia might become an active player in business and investment circles. He'd thought of the settlement as the end of their relationship, not the beginning of her transformation into a potential competitor. "What kind of investment opportunities?" he asked carefully. "There's a small consulting firm in Chicago that specializes in nonprofit management," Patricia replied. "Their founder wants to retire, and they're looking for investors who might be interested in expanding their model to other cities." Nonprofit consulting? It's a growing field. There's a lot of money in helping charitable organizations operate more efficiently. Patricia smiled. "Plus, it's the kind of work that actually makes a difference in people's lives." Keisha leaned forward, clearly excited about her mother's plans. "Mom's idea is to create a network of nonprofit consulting firms that can share resources and expertise. It could help thousands of organizations serve their communities better." "That's actually a very good idea," Marcus said, surprised by both the sophistication of the plan and his own reaction to it. During their marriage, he'd never taken Patricia's opinions about business seriously. Now he was realizing that he might have missed something important about her capabilities. "I had a lot of time to think during our marriage," Patricia said. 15 years of sitting on the sidelines watching you build a company gave me ideas about how things could be done differently. Differently how? More ethically, for one thing. With more attention to the actual impact of the work rather than just the profit margins." Patricia's voice carried a subtle edge. "And with business practices that don't depend on deceiving people about legal protections that don't actually exist." The comment hung in the air between them, a reminder of how their relationship had ended and why. Marcus found himself wondering if Patricia's new business would compete with Wellington Consulting Group in any way, and whether her 40% ownership of his company gave her access to client information or business strategies she could use against him. "Are you planning to compete with Wellington Group?" Marcus asked directly. "I'm planning to build something better than Wellington Group," Patricia replied. "But no, not directly competitive. Different market, different approach, different values." "What's that supposed to mean?" Keisha answered before her mother could respond. "It means she's going to build a company based on honesty and respect instead of manipulation and control." Marcus felt a flush of anger, but he pushed it down. These two women had cost him millions of dollars and forced him to confront his own failures. The least he could do was listen to their criticisms without defending himself. "Fair enough," Marcus said quietly. As they continued eating, the conversation gradually moved to less fraught topics. Marcus asked about Patricia's plans for the house, Keisha's college preparations, their adjustment to their new financial situation. He was surprised to discover that he was genuinely curious about their lives and concerned about their well-being in ways that went beyond guilt or legal obligation. "Can I ask you something?" Marcus said as they finished their main courses. "Of course," Patricia replied. "Why didn't you tell me about the prenup problem when you first discovered it? Why did you let me proceed with the divorce thinking I was protected?" Patricia considered the question carefully before answering. "Because you never would have believed me. If I'd come to you 6 months ago and said your prenup wasn't valid, what would you have done?" "I would have called my lawyers to verify." "No, you wouldn't," Keisha interrupted. "You would have accused Mom of lying, told her she was being manipulative, and used it as an excuse to be even more controlling about money." Marcus opened his mouth to protest, then closed it. He knew Keisha was right. "Besides," Patricia continued, "I needed time to understand the full scope of the problem and plan accordingly. If I'd told you immediately, you would have found ways to move assets, change business structures, maybe even leave the country. I needed to make sure that when the truth came out, you couldn't escape the consequences. So you planned the whole thing." "I planned to protect myself and my daughter," Patricia corrected. "Everything else was just a natural consequence of your lawyer's incompetence and your own failure to do due diligence on the most important legal document in your life." As they waited for dessert, Marcus found himself studying Patricia's face and wondering how he'd been married to her for 15 years without really seeing her. The intelligence had always been there, the strategic thinking, the careful observation of details. He'd just chosen to dismiss it because it was easier to think of her as decorative rather than dangerous. "What happens now?" Marcus asked. "Between us, I mean. Are we just business partners going forward?" "We're Keisha's parents," Patricia replied. "That's a relationship that continues regardless of everything else." "I'm not Keisha's father," Marcus pointed out. "No, but you were her stepfather for 10 years, Keisha said. "That means something, even if our relationship is complicated now." "Is it complicated?" "Marcus, you taught me a lot about how not to let people take advantage of me," Keisha said with a slight smile. "That's valuable education, even if it wasn't what you intended to teach." Marcus laughed despite himself. "So I accidentally prepared you to destroy me?" "You accidentally prepared me to think for myself and stand up to powerful men who underestimate me," Keisha corrected. "Whether that destroys you or not depends on how you choose to respond to it." After dinner, as Marcus drove them home, he found himself thinking about the strange turns his life had taken. 6 months ago, he'd been a wealthy man with what he thought was total control over his personal and professional life. Now he was a less wealthy man who was slowly learning that control had always been an illusion. "Marcus," Patricia said as he pulled up to their apartment building, "I want to thank you for dinner. This was nice." It was, Marcus agreed, surprised to realize he meant it. And I want you to know that I don't hate you, Patricia continued. I never hated you, even during the worst parts of our marriage. Then why? Because I finally learned to value myself enough to demand better treatment, Patricia replied. And because I had a daughter who was watching everything I did and learning from it. As Keisha got out of the car, she leaned back toward the driver's seat. Marcus, can I give you some advice? I suppose I owe you that much. Stop thinking of what happened to you as a disaster, Keisha said. Start thinking of it as an education. You're smarter now than you were 6 months ago, and you're free of a marriage that wasn't making either you or Mom happy. That's not a loss. That's an opportunity. Marcus watched them walk into their building. Two women who had fundamentally changed his understanding of power, intelligence, and consequences. As he drove home to his smaller house, he'd sold the mansion to help finance the settlement. He reflected on the strangest part of the entire experience. Despite everything they'd cost him, despite the humiliation and the financial losses and the complete upending of his life, Marcus found himself admiring Patricia and Keisha more now than he ever had when they'd lived under his roof. It was, he realized, the first time in their relationship that he'd seen them clearly enough to understand what he'd lost. And perhaps, if he was very lucky and very careful, it wasn't too late to build something better from the pieces of what remained. The next morning, Marcus called David Kim at the office. David, I want to schedule a meeting with Patricia to discuss the nonprofit consulting idea she mentioned. I think Wellington Group might be interested in exploring partnerships with organizations that serve the community. Partnerships with your ex-wife's new business? Partnerships with good business opportunities, Marcus corrected. It's time I learned to separate my personal feelings from my professional judgment. Are you sure about this? Marcus looked out the window of his new house at the modest garden he was learning to maintain himself. I'm sure that I've spent the last 15 years making decisions based on assumptions that turn out to be wrong. Maybe it's time to try making decisions based on facts instead. As he hung up the phone, Marcus realized that Keisha had been right about one thing. What had happened to him wasn't a disaster. It was an education. And if he was smart enough to learn from it, it might turn out to be the most valuable education of his life. Outside, the morning sun was bright and warm, and for the first time in months, Marcus Wellington felt like the day held possibilities he hadn't expected. Maybe that was enough to build on. Curiosity had started this whole avalanche. She was probably doing homework right now, maybe even writing a report about contract law for the class that had taught her how to research legal documents. Marcus picked up his phone and dialed Janet Morrison's number. This is Marcus Wellington, he said when she answered. I want to discuss the settlement terms, Chair. 24 hours ago, he'd been confidently signing divorce papers, laughing at his soon-to-be ex-wife's apparent helplessness. Now he was facing potential losses of millions of dollars, possible tax penalties, business problems, and legal fees that could bankrupt him even if he won in court. Call Janet Morrison, Marcus said finally. Set up a meeting. Let's see what Patricia wants. Are you sure? I'm sure that I need to understand exactly how bad this situation is before I decide how to fight it. As David made the call to arrange the meeting, Marcus stared out at the city skyline and wondered how many of those other buildings housed people who thought they had their lives under control, only to discover that their sense of security was built on foundations as shaky as his had been. In a few hours, he would be sitting across a negotiating table from the woman he'd underestimated for 15 years. The woman whose teenage daughter had unraveled his entire world with nothing but curiosity and a laptop. The woman who was about to teach him that intelligence and planning could be far more powerful than money and arrogance. Then, another from his accountant. Patricia's lawyer called asking for financial records. Should I cooperate? Marcus turned his phone face down and walked to his home office, the same office where Keisha had discovered the truth about his prenup just hours earlier. The filing cabinet was still open, papers scattered across his desk. He found the folder labeled Marriage Documents and pulled out his copy of the prenuptial agreement. It looked so official, so legally binding. Multiple pages of carefully crafted language, signed and witnessed, designed to protect everything he'd worked to build. But, as Marcus studied the document, he realized he'd never actually seen a filing receipt, never received confirmation that it had been properly submitted to the county clerk. He'd paid his lawyers and assumed they'd done their job. For 15 years, he'd lived with the confidence that his assets were protected, never bothering to verify the most basic requirement of a prenuptial agreement. Marcus's landline rang, the sound echoing through the empty house. He let it go to the answering machine. "Mr. Wellington, this is Jessica Chun from First National Bank. We received a court order today freezing several of your accounts pending resolution of your divorce proceedings. Please call us as soon as possible to discuss the implications of this freeze." The message continued, but Marcus had stopped listening. He walked to the window and looked out at his manicured lawn, his imported fountain, his 3-car garage filled with luxury vehicles. Tomorrow, he would start the process of learning exactly how much of it he was about to lose. But tonight, for the first time in 15 years, Marcus Wellington was truly alone in his mansion, and the silence was deafening. As Keisha walked toward the door, Marcus called after her. "You can't prove any of this in court. Even if the prenup wasn't filed properly, it would take years of litigation." Keisha turned back with a smile that was both innocent and devastating. "Maybe, but Mom's lawyer seems pretty confident about their case, especially now that she has all this evidence." After Keisha left, Marcus sat alone in his kitchen, staring at the empty space where the papers had been. His hands were shaking slightly as he reached for his phone to call Robert Chun, but something stopped him. Instead, he found himself looking around the kitchen, the marble countertops, the custom cabinets, the expensive appliances, and wondering if he was seeing it all for the last time as its owner. Outside, he could hear the sound of a car pulling into the driveway. Patricia was home, and somehow Marcus had the feeling that his real troubles were just beginning.